People and music on Energy Groove.
You're on Energy Groove Australia. This is People in Music, where we talk to people who are working behind the scenes in the music industry. Today, it's very exciting. I'm joined by Dan Rosen, who is the CEO of ARIA. How are you, Dan?
Very well, mate.
Good. Now, tell us a little bit about your background. You have a bit of a law, digital media, music background.
Yes.
And somehow you've now ended up as CEO of ARIA.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I think Steve Jobs in a speech said you can only connect the dots in reverse. And I think that's kind of with me. I basically spent my days, I studied law and, started life as a lawyer, worked as government advisor, did digital media, but every night I would go off and play gigs and play in bands, which always seemed strange to people, but I just thought for as long as people would...
Because you're wearing a suit during the day.
Yeah, and I'd get changed in my car and, have the black T-shirt in the back of the car and the guitar and the keyboards and stuff. So I was, leading a little bit of a double life, felt a bit Batman, John Wayne. But thankfully, this was the first job that I was able to combine my passion for music with my skills in law and management and strategy. So it's fantastic. It's exciting. I don't get to play as much music anymore, which is, have to maybe just defend my neighbours by playing in the house.
Tell us a little bit about your background in music. Your band Second Dan.
Yeah.
That won Triple J Unearthed in 2003.
Yes.
It's very exciting for you.
It was awesome. I played in bands my whole life. I had piano lessons as a kid, and I played in school bands, and then I think when I was 17 and I went to Byron for the first time, I realised it's hard to travel the world with a piano. So I bought a guitar in the markets there and taught myself guitar and then ended up playing more guitar and playing in original bands all through university, and then had a breakaway band from my existing band, which was called Second Dan, which was my kind of a joke on an alter ego. Which I started with another guy called Dan, and we won Triple J Unearthed. So we had back in those days, I think they used to unearth one region of the country every year. So it was a very big spotlight. You got announced on the Monday, and that Friday you're playing the Corner Hotel for 1,000 people in Melbourne. And
was that surprising for you?
Yeah, I guess you never think you could win it, but I thought we'd written a good tune and we had some good chops, so it was fantastic. So got to tour around Australia and play all the big festivals, and then I moved over to New York and continued the band over there and put out a few records in America and toured around America. What
was the culture like in the US in comparison to what you found here?
It's a much more collegiate from a songwriting perspective. I was living in New York, down in the East Village, Lower East Side, and I think Americans seem to be a bit more open to collaborations in songwriting, which I think is starting to happen more in Australia. But back when I was growing up in Melbourne, it was a little bit, that was your band, that was my band. And
why do you think that is, that they're a little bit more open to that?
I think it's a combination of the Nashville method.
Yeah.
That's how people write. And also it's a bigger market, so there's more opportunities for songwriters. And I think people in Australia potentially is more of a zero-sum game. If you're successful, I'm not. Whereas in America, it's a bigger market. I think that is definitely starting to change in Australia. But certainly maybe 15 years ago, it felt a bit more like that. But if there's anything, I think collaborations and that ability to share your art and share creativity is always a good thing.
What initially drew you to music? Obviously, you mentioned that you started playing instruments at quite a young age. What was it about music that kind of spoke to you?
Yeah, I don't know. I think when I was a kid, I thought that everybody was interested in music, and it's only as you kind of get a little bit older that you realise, maybe I'm more attracted to this than others.
Yeah.
One of my earliest memories, my mum picking me up from school and when I was 8 years old, and telling me that Synchronicity had won, Every Breath You Take had won Song of the Year at the Grammys. I was a huge Police fan. It was the first album that I bought, and I've still got that album.
Have you?
It's a Synchronicity on red vinyl.
Wow.
I take it everywhere I go. And I actually I met Sting briefly in LA, and I got to tell him the story.
Did you?
Which was cool.
Yeah.
He said he doesn't even have it on red vinyl.
Really?
Yeah. So,
there you go.
it's something that spoke to me from a young age. I loved the Police and Cold Chisel. They were my two bands that I was obsessed with. And I owned Synchronicity, and I had a best of Cold Chisel record.
Yeah.
And I didn't, at the time, I didn't realise the difference between best ofs and actual albums. So I tell John Watson, their manager now, that I thought it was the greatest album of all time. It was wall-to-wall hits.
Coming up, The ARIA Awards turns 30.
When the ARIA is at its best, it's about helping artists break from what might be, the more fringe into mainstream, which allows them to sell more music, sell more tickets, have a sustainable career.
Hear what Dan Rosen can reveal about the milestone next on People in Music. You're on Energy Groove Australia, live around the world from energy-groove.com on TuneIn and iTunes. This is People in Music. My name's Brad. That was Haim with Forever. We also heard Jared James before that with Do You Remember. If you'd like to follow up on anything about People in Music, make sure you hit up the Why Music Matters website, whymusicmatters.org. Our special guest this evening is ARIA CEO Dan Rosen.
People in Music on Energy Groove.
All right, now tell us a little bit about how you, I guess, moved on from music in a way, even though you haven't moved on from music at all, but kind of started working in law and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, as I said, I never really saw the two as precluding me from playing. And I got into law from school and, it continued to study and I was quite interested in that as well. And I always felt in good balance, actually.
So it was just another interest
for you. I felt in good balance that was feeding different parts of me. And And at various stages in my life, I've been more focused on one part or the other. But thankfully, I'd been able to combine them and have moderate success in music that enabled me to keep going. And people would come to the shows and listen to the songs, so that it was enough encouragement for me to continue to do it. And I think that it's certainly now it gives me great perspective to be able to have had that understanding of what it's like to be an artist and understanding of what it's like to be on the road and making albums and being an independent artist and how difficult it is, really.
I suppose it's quite a benefit having a CEO of, the Australian Recording Industry Association, having that experience of being a musician. Does that help you in your role?
I think so. I mean, I don't know any different, but I absolutely try to come at most things from the perspective of an artist and how an artist would at least assess it. Now, I'm not claiming that I was the world's greatest artist, but I think you do, a lot of artists that I grew up playing with in Melbourne have gone on to achieve great success in Australia, and I've got to play, in America and tour with some great bands. And so I think you can bring that perspective and you understand from a creative point of view when you're talking to an artist where they might be coming from. And similarly, when you're talking to policymakers or negotiating for copyright and license rights, that it matters. And it matters to the artist and it matters to the label. And, every time where we go into a fight, and we have a lot of fights, where you're trying to either protect the value of copyright or promote the value of the recordings, you come at it from a perspective that you're doing it, I say to staff, we're on the side of the angels, we're working for the good guys. And it's important to remember that when you do get into some of these more difficult matters. So I hope it helps. I really, I still love music as much as I ever have, and I'm still inspired listening to new music. And, I feel at the moment in Australia, we're probably producing as good a period of music as we ever have. Which is exciting, and it's starting to show around the world. Tell
us a little bit about ARIA for those who may not know what the purpose of ARIA was when it was originally set up.
I can't speak for the founding fathers.
No.
But, ARIA is there to promote and protect the interests of the Australian recording industry. And, that's starting with the labels, majors and independents. We have over 120 members, of which 3 of them are majors and the remainder of them are independent. And then through that, the interests of recording artists. And the most public things we do are the awards and the charts, but behind the scenes there's a lot of work in terms of protecting and promoting the industry to make sure that the government settings and the business settings are such that the industry can thrive.
Now, you mentioned the ARIA Awards in there, which is, I guess, one of the more publicly known things to people here and overseas. Yeah. It's celebrating its 30th anniversary this year.
Yes.
Yeah, which is quite a feat.
Yeah.
It started in 1987.
Yes.
And I saw a picture of John Farnham holding a lot of awards for the first one.
Fantastic head of hair.
He cleaned up, yes, yeah, and the hair as well. Tell us, why do you think it's important that the Australian music industry has a means for artists and peers to celebrate their creations?
Yeah. Well, to me, it's probably the one time of the year that people outside the music industry really focus on music and on Australian music. And I think if we can shine a beacon on on the incredible stuff that's going on in Australia, that to me is really important. And, when the ARIA is at its best, it's about helping artists break from what might be, the more fringe into mainstream, which allows them to sell more music, sell more tickets, have a sustainable career. And the more artists that we can help have a sustainable career, that really is the goal. We want artists to be able to, if they can, give up their day jobs and focus fully and immerse themselves in their art and their creativity. And, the ARIA is an amazing opportunity for us to promote that to Australia. And it's not to say it doesn't happen other times throughout the year, but it is a great time where mainstream Australia and mainstream press, not just the music press, will cover what's happening in Australian music. And free-to-air TV will put something on that's not necessarily a music talent show, but is the most talent. And I'm not denigrating that. I think that serves a purpose, but it is the time where the most talented people in Australia get to perform and show their wares. And increasingly, we're getting a lot of interest from around the world. We're getting great artists from overseas to be part of the ARIAs, and that helps us promote the ARIAs outside of just Australia. And we've broadcast the show the last 2 years, and we'll do again this year, all throughout Asia on Star World, which is the biggest entertainment channel throughout Asia. We get a huge amount of media pickup throughout Europe and the US, and through socials we're able to really promote, and that's very exciting.
Are Australia's copyright laws out of date?
Copyright is the way that labels and publishers and many artists earn returns for their work. So any amendments to that need to be carefully considered.
We hear the thoughts of ARIA CEO Dan Rosen. Up next on People in Music.
People in Music on Energy Groove.
So it kind of sounds like that the ARIAs, 30 years on, are just as relevant now as they were when they started, and probably even more so now because of the fact that we're in this globalized world now, and music is so accessible to anyone and everyone who has an internet connection. So do you agree with that in that sense, that because the ARIAs can be broadcast and obviously you're getting these international artists in, that it's more important that you push that name out there and that Australian music culture?
I think so. It's had an incredibly illustrious history. I remember being a kid at home. My favourite band growing up was once I became post my police cultures days when I was 8 or 9. When I was a teenager, UMI were my favourite band, and must have seen them play over 50 times and bought every record at Greville Street Records, where they used to do car park shows. And I still remember being at home the night where they won all the ARIA awards for their albums, and when when Timmy Rogers performed with Silverchair, doing New Race by Radio Birdman, and just being so excited that my band was there up on the on the national stage. And I hope that the next generation of music fans still feel that when their bands that they love get up on the ARIA stage and get to perform and get to say thank you. And we live in such a fast media-paced world, but it's once a year to have that focus on what's happening in Australia, and having an event that does resonate around the world is super cool.
Tell us about the selection process for the ARIA Awards. What's the process there for artists?
It's like the Hunger Games.
Is it?
No, it's essentially we have a committee that looks at the nominations, and it's usually based around the most nominated artists, and particularly ones that have been nominated for Album of the Year or Song of the Year as the two major awards. So over the years, if you look at it, tend to be the people that perform, and then it's also having balance to make sure you're putting on a show that's going to resonate with the Australian people. So it's a balancing act.
Does the panel of judges change every year? Or?
Yeah, it does. We're going through that process at the moment. There's about 800-900 people on the voting panel.
Wow.
Yeah. And they're divided into... This is not to decide who performs. This is the voting panel for the ARIAs and deciding on them. And that's broken down into various voting schools. So if you're an expert in country music, you'll be on the country music panel and not on the dance music panel. And then there's a few awards that everyone gets to vote on, which is Album of the Year, Song of the Year, Male, Female. So that's an ongoing process, and each year you reassess where's the trends moving in music. And over the last few years, it's been, as the streaming services and digital services have increased, you have to increase their participation, making sure you have a good balance between media and artists and industry.
Now, Just on that, with the digital media services and the digitization of things, copyright's a bit of a hot topic at the moment. Purely, I guess, the Productivity Commission's review so brought a bit of light onto that.
Yeah.
Plus, we're seeing, I guess, more recently this week with the, I guess there's just issue of the fashion designers getting their designs ripped off and everything from big corporations with the use of the internet. Do you believe the copyright laws need to be updated?
Well, copyright is a difficult issue, but essentially copyright is the way that most people in the music industry make their money. You're putting live to one side, but even on live, through APRA you get your returns, and through PPCA, if people are playing recorded music, you get returns there. So copyright is the way that labels and publishers and many artists earn returns for their work. So any amendments to that need to be carefully considered. And I don't think anybody believes that the law should be frozen in time. But certainly any change needs to be evidence-based. And I think the difficulty is, the other side of the debate says, well, things aren't working, therefore we need to make these change. But when you actually drill down and argue, well, what are the problems that we're trying to solve, and can we solve those problems by making small amendments rather than making these wholesale changes? And that's really the debate that we want to have. We're not saying that copyright can't evolve and copyright doesn't need any reform, but we also say we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater and upturn all of this commercial work that's happening. And if we look in Australia, we have a market that works incredibly well. We have, over 30 legal music services in Australia. You can get any music you want. There's no time and date between here and the rest of the world. In fact, we usually get things just by the virtue of the time zone. Everything's released on a Friday. We usually get it 12 hours before it goes anywhere else in Europe and then the US. You can get music for free signing up to a legal service, whether that's Spotify, have their free services. So there's no reason why people shouldn't be having access to music. And, if you want to license music, there are ways to get that done. So we believe the market works incredibly well. There's not to say that you can't tinker around at the edges, but we don't believe that there needs to be wholesale changes.
What if there were adjustments to be made? What adjustments would you like?
Well, the big adjustment for us from a recording side on the Copyright Act is there's still a 1% cap on what radio pays for music, and that's certainly something. It's the only industry where the copyright is set between two big industries. So if we are going to look at reform of the copyright law, I think that would issue number one for the recording industry. And other than that, it's really about understanding what are the issues that we believe are being impeded. And, are they actually being impeded, or is it just because people don't really want to pay, or can we make some changes to it? So I think that's having a dialogue and understanding that.
Coming up, has the music industry finally found its feet in the digital world?
Last year we saw a 5% increase in the recording industry in Australia. So hopefully we're at that tipping point back up where the industry can return to growth. ARIA
CEO Dan Rosen will be back to tell us more shortly on People in Music.
People in Music on Energy Groove.
Now, the music industry, I guess, in my opinion, has kind of been leading the digital revolution. Like, they've really embraced change. Like, we have a lot more services now. People can access music worldwide whenever they like, as you mentioned, through legal streaming services. What challenges do you see going forward for those producing and making music as we move to a more digitised economy?
I absolutely agree with you that the music industry has led on digitisation and going through digital disruption. I don't think that was a choice.
No, it wasn't a choice. It wasn't easy, but it
certainly wasn't easy. But, if we think Napster was released in 1999, so we've got 17 years of dealing with digital disruption. And we're really in the second phase of digital in that, the first phase was moving to a download model, and now we're moving through to a streaming model. Last year we saw a 5% increase in the recording industry in Australia. So hopefully we're at that tipping point back up where the industry can return to growth. Yeah, it's a different way of working for a recording artist. The streaming model, as opposed to the download model or the physical model, where it would be a one hit where you would get all your payment in one hit, to a streaming model where it's more of an annuity stream that gives you small bites over a longer period of time. So I think that's an adjustment. Certainly, we're now working in a global market where your song can be heard on a streaming service by anyone, anywhere around the world, which represents an incredible opportunity for Australian artists who are creating world-class music, that their music can be heard by anyone. And that is starting to be borne out by the number of Aussie artists that are starting to break overseas. And I think, 10, 15 years ago, you might get one Aussie act that would break every couple of years, and now we're getting a few acts that are breaking each year. So that's very exciting. I think, the corollary of that is it also means that everyone else from around the world can get their music heard in Australia. So those natural barriers to entry of being able to, make sure you had Australian stock in the JB Hi-Fi store or your local record store. In the streaming world, that's a bit more difficult. And I think the other challenge we're facing is around playlists and global playlists as people start moving towards listening to playlists that might be programmed out of Stockholm or Silicon Valley. How do we make sure that Australian acts are still getting heard?
And I imagine for music creators, there are a number of challenges, such as artists being able to find an audience as well. How do you see the artist dealing with the digitization of things? Say, for example, if you were producing music and you wanted to make an album and get that album out overseas.
Yeah.
What do you recommend for artists in order to break it overseas? Like, obviously making it local is one thing, but also finding an audience overseas.
Yeah, it's probably easier than ever before to find an audience. I think you need to work really, really hard and try, if you're in a particular niche, to make sure that you're dealing with the right blogs and the right labels and the right radio stations in different markets that might be interested in your niche, and putting your music out to the world and working really, really hard. And, you need a little bit of luck, but as they say, the harder you work, the luckier you get. There's no tried and true method. You speak to people who are successful and each one of them will have a different story about how their song broke. There's amazing stories about how certain acts get their things heard overseas, but, each one will be different. But each one of them, it's not like they only chose one method. They would work incredibly hard. And the number one thing is to make great music and keep making great music.
ARIA CEO Dan Rosen will be back shortly, chatting to us about what challenges the music industry is facing going forward.
Government does want to take the creative industry seriously. They want to be a creative centre of the Asia Pacific and the world. But I don't think you can have that objective on one hand and on the other hand make it impossible to have a thriving nightlife. I think that's an incredible part of being a creative city.
That's coming up next, right here on People in Music.
People and Music on Energy Groove.
Now, there are a number of challenges that the industry is facing at the moment, I guess, obviously with the copyright, digitisation, as well as in Sydney we're dealing with lockout laws and that kind of stuff. What's your take on the lockout laws and that issue, just quickly?
Yeah, I think it feels like a sledgehammer to to something that was a problem, but I'm not sure it was the solution to the problem. And I'm hopeful that they're looking at the issue now, and I'm hopeful that the government will recognise that they can make some adjustments to it that doesn't disproportionately impact the music industry and the cultural life of New South Wales. I chaired the Creative Industries Task Force for New South Wales, and I think the government does want to take the creative industry seriously. They want to be a creative centre of the Asia Pacific and the world, but I don't think you can have that objective on one hand and on the other hand make it impossible to have a thriving nightlife. I think that's an incredible part of being a creative city and attracting creative people to want to live in Sydney. So there has to be a balance there. They've probably got the balance too far one way, but I'm optimistic that the Deputy Premier's made some pretty positive noises that they're at least open to hearing the evidence, and I'm hopeful that once this inquiry comes back, they're going to make some amendments to it.
You're a Melbourne boy.
Yeah.
So you've seen, I guess, Melbourne's live music scene, and you probably still see it.
Yeah.
Have you noticed, I mean, obviously the industry has noticed a difference now in the Sydney nightlife. Are you seeing a dramatic difference between the Melbourne music scene and the Sydney music scene now? The
Sydney music scene has been incredibly resilient in spite of all these obstacles. I think Melbourne takes its live music incredibly seriously, and it was heartening to see the Premier of Victoria come out yesterday very strongly saying that he doesn't think lockout laws are the way to go. And I do believe that both the City of Sydney and the New South Wales government recognise that music and creativity is essential to the future of this state. The jobs of the future are going to be creative jobs. And, things like the lockout laws do impact that. There's obviously a lot of other things they can do to promote that, but we need to learn from Melbourne. Melbourne's one of the great music cities of the world. Think about, Sydney, the electronic music that's come out of Sydney over the last few years. You look at Flume, who's probably Australia's great global success story over the last couple of years.
It's a big export, yeah.
And, it's coming out of the Sydney scene, flight facilities. Quite a lot of the guys are coming out of here as well. So there are opportunities. We're just going to make sure we keep them open and get the next generation of people growing up in Sydney believing that they can also be fantastic artists.
So you are quite optimistic about the Australian music industry.
I'm really
the future.
I'm really optimistic. Even when I took the job, I remember people saying, well, why would you want to go work in the music business? It's a dying business. And the truth was that even at that time, people were listening to more music than ever before. People love music. It's an inherent thing that we don't need to teach people, thankfully, to love music. There's a new generation of kids that are born and find a boy band or a pop star and they love music. And you don't teach a kid to love music. So we're incredibly fortunate that we're working in something that people are passionate about. The challenge for the industry is, well, how do we monetize that? How do we make sure that there's still artists to be able to have sustainable careers to be able to make that music? And for me, the challenge is to make sure that Australians are making that music and there's an Australian industry that's growing, because you don't want to be in a situation where we're dominated by 2 or 3 global streaming services and all the music we consume gets made out of overseas. So that's the dystopian view. The optimistic view is people are engaging with streaming services. People are starting to pay for music again. We've seen huge growth in the take-up of Spotify and Apple Music. We have a new crop of Australian artists that are dominating overseas festivals and overseas charts. So I think it's a very, very exciting time. And, you can be living in Surrey Hills or in Collingwood or Fortitude Valley and you write a great song and everyone around the world can hear that within 24 hours.
It's exciting times.
That's very cool.
All right, now finally...
Got to get the band back together.
Yeah. Opportunities ahead. Now, tell me a little bit about the playlist that you are listening to at the moment. Who's spinning in your car, on your CD player at home? What are you listening to?
I just, last week, a Sydney band, Gang of Youths, put out their new record. And I've been...
They have a new record?
Yeah.
Oh,
it was
I've
number
missed
2.
that
It was
one.
number 2 in the charts.
I missed that one.
Yeah. Okay, listen to it.
I love their debut.
Yeah, so it was, I was up at Splend Up and the 2 bands that really stood out from an Australian perspective were Gang of Youths and Sticky Fingers, and they both played the main stage and had the crowd absolutely rocking and singing along, and it was awesome to see. I'm a rock guy, so great to see that, guys with guitars and long hair and can still fill an amphitheatre. So that was very, very exciting, and so I'm listening to that. I think that the new Flume record, well, it's not that new anymore, but that is an incredible piece of work. That set was insane up at Splendor, but he's almost created his own genre of music, and you hear a song straight away, and that's just it sounds like Flume, and there are people trying to sound like Flume now, which is an incredible effort. So I listen to a lot of old stuff as well, but in terms of the new Aussie bands, I'm actually feeling quite excited about what's going on. Dustin Tebbit has a new record out, which I was listening to this week, which is beautiful sounding, great songs. So there's no shortage of fantastic stuff to listen to.
Well, Dan, it's been a pleasure chatting to you. Thanks so much for joining us on People in Music.
Thank you for having me.
Energy Groove and Music Matters presents People in Music.
A big thank you to Dan Rosen this evening, the CEO of ARIA, for joining us for People in Music this month. If you would like to follow up on any information about ARIA, do hit up their website. It's aria.com.au. And if you'd like to follow up on tonight's episode or any other previous episodes of People in Music, you can certainly do that on the website there. It's whymusicmatters.org. A big thank you to Music Rights Australia, as always, for helping us produce this program. And thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure having your company. My name's Brad. Until next month for another episode of People in Music, have a great one and enjoy the music. I'm leaving you tonight with a track from Sydney act Gang of Youths. This is Restraint and Release.